One of the great problems with the Bristol scheme before we set it up was how on earth can an English, but German Beamter auf Lebenszeit be living in England? It didn't sound right. And even the head of the legal department could not work out how it could be made legal. And Wolfgang Iser, I've told you about him, he was the genius behind all these schemes. He went to the Ministry of Education to discuss it, to see if a solution could be found. And you'll never guess what the solution was. Can you guess? You can't. Nobody can. Bristol University was recognized as a department of Constance University. I think that's just brilliant. And it worked. You know, they accepted it. Yeah.
The whole university.
Yeah. I'd set up a department of Constance University at Bristol.
That's cool.
Simple. We were in Constance and we had decided that the children should be brought up in England because in Constance they were rarities. So we wanted them to go to school in England. That meant you start school at 5. Actually, Jenny started earlier. She was so way ahead of everybody. And so what we decided was to buy a house. Shall I tell you the story of how we decided that we would buy a house in England. We were living in Haguenau at the time, and we liked the West Country. And this is the West Country. And my theatre agent at the time had a house in the West Country. So we got him to send us a huge bunch of local papers with the stories of the houses on sale. And we had a letter back from an agent in Bridgewater, which is a town it's 12 miles away. And that was so impressive, we decided we would go there and look for a house. 2 little children, one on the way, midwinter. This is a little part of the anecdote. I was packing the car and I was attacked by 2 Alsatian dogs, one of which bit me in the leg. So I'm thinking about, is this a sign that we shouldn't go? Went to the doctor, had a shot, tetanus, anti-tetanus. We went, and to cut a long story short, this agent was brilliant. And we bought a house in Bridgewater in 1969. And there is another connection with the West Country, which was that Bristol University had opened up a drama department. It was the first drama department in the country, I think. And I'd had this vague idea, if we're going back to England, maybe I'll get a job in the drama department in Bristol. So I wanted us to be fairly near Bristol anyway. Bridgewater is about an hour away from Bristol, so that fitted the bill perfectly. And the decision was we would leave Constance in 1972 so the children would go to school in Bridgewater. There was a nice school in Bridgewater, we found out. And so 1972 was the year that was earmarked for me to leave.
However, you said you finally leave Constance 2000. What happened between these years?
Can you tell us more about your relationship with Constance, so to say?
Right. Well, I told Wolfgang, we have to leave. And Wolfgang didn't want me to leave. You can imagine we were friends and it would be very difficult to keep the friendship and my translation and so forth of his work going. And an extraordinary thing happened. The Ministry of Education issued a ruling that anybody studying languages must spend a period of time abroad. So that's part one of the extraordinary thing that happened. One of his assistants came up with an idea. Why doesn't David establish a relationship with a British university and we send our students there to conform to the regulations. Next piece of luck. One of Isa's assistants, a man called Armin Gerards, at the time was a lecturer at Bristol University in the German department. Armin Gerards had a word with the people in the German department. They had contact with lots of German universities, exchange visits. Bristol students go to Germany, lots of them. And German students come, they had a maximum of 5, I think, from each university. All these different German universities coming to Bristol. But they had nobody who was capable of teaching the Germans what they needed to be taught. Well, there's me. So this is how luck plays such an enormous role. They were delighted if I would come over. Initially, I'll sort of try and cut it all short, I met the man who was running things there in the German department, not the professor, who was a horrible man, but the man who was in charge of all these foreign students. What did I have to offer? Well, there was me. I train my constant students for the Staatsexamen. I give courses in translation and in grammar. I couldn't offer them essay writing, that would have been impossible. But I also lecture to them on literature. Perfect. Can you do the same for our other German students? So the deal was, I could bring at that time, I'm cutting it fairly short because there's lots of other details, but I would be allowed to bring over in the whole academic year a maximum of 20 students, but never all at the same time, so that they could sort of mingle, that was their idea, mingle with all those that they already had. They had about 25 students from other universities. So basically the scheme that we settled with, to cut the story shorter again, I said, right, I will give the non-constant students their own translation lessons, their own grammar lessons, and I will give talks. All my constant students had to study a Shakespeare play. So I will give a course on a Shakespeare play every term. So your students, your Bristol students, will have 6 hours with me. And then I will give all my other courses. Now, for my constant students who came over, I gave them separate translation because they needed the more individual tuition, separate translation, separate grammar, though they would be the same texts. Let them write essays. They would write essays. They attend the Shakespeare course. They have individual tutorials with me for their pronunciation. That was the deal. Bristol were delighted. They paid me, I had to be a member of staff. Obviously, you have to be insured. I'd have an office and so forth. To start with, they paid me £250 a year. And after a couple of years, they raised that to £350 a year, which is a joke. But it was a gesture, because what I got was that my students could come over. After about 4 or 5 years, this scheme worked so well, and I got on so well with everybody in the department. They cut the limit. I could have as many as I liked. I could have exam candidates coming over for a few weeks just to train with me. I had access to the university accommodation office, so the accommodation office laid on accommodation for the students. There was no hassle. Bureaucracy, one tiny form. If you went to a British or German university in those days, there was a huge bureaucratic element that had to be fulfilled. One tiny form, because it came through me. And so what we had in the end was a totally flexible scheme, as many students as wanted to come. But of course, I still came to Constance, and I can't remember now what you've recorded and what you haven't recorded. Initially, I came over 4 times a year. Did we record that part of things? I came over 4 times a year to run the theatre, to run Univers and the Writers Group. Intensive courses for 2 generations of exam candidates. And this is also something that's interesting. I used to give them one generation would do their translation exercise and their essays. The other generation would train with me to do the oral exams. Did I tell you about the oral exams? Yeah. Right. Even the birth, this is another anecdote, but even the birth of the oral exams is an anecdote connected with Walter Rauschecker. Walter was taking his Staatsexamen, and he was not the most confident. He was totally confident on stage, but he was not confident off the stage. And so privately I said with the oral exam, okay, we'll rehearse it. And this was so good that I decided I would do that with all my students. So that's how the oral tutorials came about, just through a friendship. And then I made that part of my whole program. But all of that, of course, was enormously draining, especially for Elizabeth with 3 little children. I cut out the theatre I handed over to Tessa. I've told you the story of Univers. And then I was able to cut my visits to Constance down to twice a year. It was still killing, because the number of exam candidates got bigger and bigger. It's all very well giving tutorials to half a dozen people. When you've got 40 people, wow. But that was the story there, and I've forgotten how I got onto that. I was telling you about the Bristol scheme. And that set a precedent, and that, if only they had continued. But when I retired, Constance wanted it to continue, but Bristol didn't, because they would have had to pay somebody full time, and I was dirt cheap. But that is a wonderful way of actually doing it. If you've got people who are studying for their Staatsexamen who want to be teachers of English, must spend time abroad. But there's this problem. How are they going to train for their Staatsexamen when they're abroad? If you've got somebody who knows the system, and I was the examiner for essay writing and in translation. So they come to me in Bristol so they can polish up their English, and they're getting direct training. And the same applied to all the students from the other universities. They were all studying for the Staatsexamen. Nearly all of them wanted to be teachers. So they needed this specialist knowledge. Translation was compulsory. I don't know if it still is. German, English. You wouldn't know either. You have to have the knowledge of grammar. And they had to write an essay. So perfect. They trained for me in Bristol. They got the best of both worlds.
Yeah. If I think about it, spending my semester like that would be great. So yeah.
And it was fascinating. And even some of the students who were not from Constance, I'm still in touch with some of them. Because for them it was so beneficial. They were being taught the things they needed to know for their exams. You couldn't have a better scheme, could you? And imagine if they worked that out, both from both sides. If English students went over there and they had somebody teaching, a German teaching them what they need to know for their exam, what could be better? And I actually had some people, I cheated, but I could get away with anything then. But there were some people who were studying Verwaltung, who wanted to perfect their English. So they would come along to me. And then I would say to Bristol, these are my students, because in Bristol it was supposed to be just from the English department. And even from the English department it was supposed to be, in Germany, but it didn't matter. If they wanted to come, I let them come. Why not? And there was one, this is another anecdote, but I'm still in touch with him, a student who was not studying English, he was studying Verwaltung, but actually he wanted to be an actor. And he came over and he studied with me. We got on very well. And he couldn't really make up his mind what he wanted to do. I'll cut this story very short. You'll never guess what happened to him. He lives in England now. He decided he wanted to be a doctor. So he gave up all his other studies. He became a doctor. He's a doctor in England now. And he married an Indian who is also a doctor. And he lives in England and is very happy in England. I let him come. This was a favour from me to let him come. But you see how things work out. It's extraordinary, the stories that arise out of little tiny things. This guy just on a hunch he wanted to come to England. Isn't that? It's nice, isn't it?
It is.
So you said it all ended 2000 around. Throughout.
Yes, in 2000, this is another tiny anecdote. All these students, you see, I had all the constant students sending me work for a correspondence course, which is enormously time consuming. By then I had something like 50 German students. There would be 20 or more. You know, the rule about 20 went out of the window. I could have as many as I liked. So I would have 25 or so non-constant students, 20 or so constant students, still marking all their work, and all this work flooding in from constants. Fine when you've got half a dozen students sending you work, not when you've got 30 or 40. I had to cut. Initially, I'd say they could send me one piece of work a week. I had to cut it to one a fortnight. Even then, it was almost impossible to cope. And the anecdote, which still makes me sad, it shows you how deep things sink into you. I had a girl, a Staatsexamen candidate, who came over to Bristol to train with me. And she wrote an essay. And it was a grade 6. You can't get lower than a grade 6. It was really bad. And when I was sitting at home marking it, I made a mental note to myself, which was so stupid. I must talk to this girl before I give her the paper. I compressed all my lessons into Tuesdays and Fridays so I would have the time for all the marking. That would probably have been on a Tuesday. On the Friday, I gave back all the papers. I'd had such a huge accumulation of work, I forgot. And I gave, instead of saying to her, no, we need to have a talk, I just gave her the paper. I'd totally forgotten. And after the lesson, she was in tears. She was a little bit aggressive, but I think understandably so. She'd done work in Constance and she'd never had such a terrible grade. And I'd messed it up. There was no way round the grade 6. It was bad. But I should have taken her aside, not given it to her, taken her aside. And that was a sign to me that now I was not giving the service I should give. So it was possible in those days to retire at 63. The retirement age was 65. I don't know what it is now. And so that was it. I'm retiring at 63 as soon as I can. I can't go on like this. It wasn't fair on the students. And I can't remember the girl's name. I think she finished up with a grade 3. You know, she didn't fail. But her face, I can still see her face and hear, you know, what she was saying to me. And that really hurt. And so 2000 was the end. I'll tell you something else which is interesting. I don't want to sort of blow my own trumpet, but it worked. Initially, the ministry insisted there should be somebody who would test these people to see that they really did improve. They were paying my salary, so they wanted proof that the scheme worked. And we had to have a neutral person who would examine papers from the beginning and examine papers from the end. And of course, this was also something. All the students, whether they were first year or Staatsexamen, they came to me and I applied the same standard. You need to know right from the beginning what is expected of you at the end. So all the translations, essays and things were marked by Staatsexamen standards. Anyway, to cut that story short, we kept papers from the beginning and papers from the end. And she was a woman and she would have these papers and the improvement was huge. It had to be. The students knew what they had to do and they worked. I made them work. My lessons, I like to think, were very entertaining. We used to have a lot of fun. But nevertheless, they were serious because the standard, I wouldn't change the standard.
Mm-hmm.
And again, with the Staatsexamen, our grades were very high. And someone was sent from the ministry to monitor what was going on. And they said, yeah, the standard is high.
Good.
It's not just me, it was the scheme.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because so many of them came over,
Yeah.
and some of them stayed a year. Well, you're studying for a year. I would never let them speak one word of German in my presence. And you're in a country for a year, you're studying at the university. They were even allowed to go to attend other courses if they had another subject.
Mm-hmm.
But they were immersed. I'm sure amongst themselves they spoke German, but they were living with English people. They were lodged.
Mm.
And what better scheme could you have? So the Bristol scheme was a huge success, but it ended when I finished. So that was the Bristol scheme. That's a happy story.